Hello friends and seekers of wisdom. Following ancient Greek mythology, we now take a giant leap into ancient Chinese mythology, one of the world's oldest and most complex mythological systems. Life was always built upon the perfect balance of the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. In this system, creation did not occur through a single explosion, but through the awakening of a titan from a cosmic egg after hundreds of thousands of years of patience. Today, we will explore the mountains formed by Pangu's breath, humanity shaped by the clay of the goddess Nu, Shan who attained immortality through his quest for wisdom, and the epic adventures of the rebellious Monkey King's son, Wukong. Unlike Greek mythology, Chinese myths generally emphasize universal order, Tao, and social harmony, rather than individual tragedies. These stories are a unique source for understanding the price of patience, family, and defying the heavens. As we embark on this journey into the mysterious, profound, and millennial world of Chinese legends, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. In the beginning there was no sky, no earth, no sun to mark the passing of hours, nor moon to measure the slow turning of months. There was only the boundless dark, a formless soup of shadow and light, unborn, a place without direction or sound where time had no meaning in space, no edges. It was chaos, pure and unbroken. A heavy stillness that pressed upon itself for countless ages until within its depths something began to stir. The ancient storytellers said it was as if the world to be was sleeping within an egg, its shell holding all things stone and water, breath and flame, locked together in restless dreaming for 18,000 years. This egg floated in the void, cradling within it a vast potential, and then without warning the shell cracked, and from the fracture spilled the first breath of wind, the first glimmer of light, and the first groan of a being too great to remain bound. From the darkness rose Pangu, the first and mightiest of giants, his form so vast that his head brushed against the curved shell above him, and his feet pressed into the deep below. In his hands he held a mighty axe, shaped from the same raw stuff as the chaos around him, and with this weapon he struck. The blow resounded like thunder in a hollow sky, splitting the egg in two. From the lighter, purer essence sprang the heavens, rising and stretching upward. From the heavier, darker essence fell the earth, sinking and pressing downward. But the two, young and restless, threatened to tumble back into one another, to crush all the space between. So Pangu planted his feet upon the earth and thrust his shoulders against the sky, straining with all the strength of his colossal frame to keep them apart. Thus began his long vigil. Each day the sky rose 10 feet higher, each day the earth grew 10 feet thicker, and Pangu himself grew to match them, his body lengthening and his strength deepening, lest the heavens collapse or the ground rise to meet them. Seasons came and went, though there was as yet no sun or moon to measure them, only the shifting of warmth and chill in the air. Mountains swelled beneath his feet, and the stars to be glimmered faintly above his head, watching the giants labor in silent awe. For 18,000 years he held this burden without rest, his breath the wind that scoured the young earth, his voice the rumble of fair of thunder, his sweat the rain that darkened the soil. Alone in a world still finding its shape, Pangu's strength became the pillar on which all future life would rest. And though no mortal eyes yet existed to witness it, the memory of his lonely task would live forever in the bones of the mountains and the endless vault of the sky. When at last the labor of holding heaven and earth apart was done, when the sky stood high and steady and the earth lay wide and firm beneath Pangu's strength, spent across the long millennia, began to one. He had been the solitary steward of all that existed, a living wall between the realms. And now that his duty was fulfilled, the weight of his vigil pressed upon him like a mountain sapping the last reserves of his immense power. The wind that once roared from his lungs slowed to a whisper, the thunder in his voice faded to a dull echo, and the towering figure who had shaped the world began to sink to his knees. His breathing grew shallow, his gaze, those vast luminous eyes that had watched over the widening gulf between sky and earth, dimmed to the soft, dying glow of embers. With no companion to mourn him, no creature yet born to speak his name, Pangu lay himself down between the young heaven he had raised and the new earth he had studied, and in that final rest his body became the last and greatest gift to the world he had forged. It is said that, in the stillness after his passing the heavens, bent low as if in silent homage, and the earth seemed to sigh, accepting the charge that its maker had borne for so long. Then slowly Pangu's great form began to change. From his last breath came the wind that would forever move across the land from his final exhalation. The clouds that would drift through the air, his mighty voice, stilled in death, became the deep roll of thunder that would echo in the mountains. During storms, the left eye, bright and fierce, rose into the heavens as the sun, and the right, cool and serene, became the moon, so that day and night might forever share the sky. From his hair and beard sprang the canopy of stars, scattered like sparks from the forge of creation, their cold fires marking the seasons for all who would come to walk beneath them. His massive frame gave shape to the land itself. The blood that coursed through his veins spilled outward to form the river's winding silver, and red across the face of the earth, and his flesh turned to fertile soil, dark and rich, from which the first forests would rise. His bones hard as iron became the mountains and hills, their peaks jutting like spears into the air, and the marrow within them hardened into the precious metals and stones that men would one day prize. His skin turned into the fields and plains, his sweat into the rain and dew that would nourish them. Even his voice in death carried power. Still some say that echo of his dying cry sank into the ground and became the hidden rumble of earthquakes. A reminder that the world, though formed, would never be entirely still. Nothing of him was wasted, his teeth and nails hardened into the O's buried deep within. The rock waiting to be discovered by those yet to be born. The fleas and tiny vermin that had lived in his vast hair were scattered across the land, and under the touch of heaven became the animals that would roam the forests and fields. In this way Pangu's death was no end but a final act of creation, his body and spirit dissolving into every corner of the world, ensuring that life would not merely exist but flourish. There was no tomb for him, no monument carved in his likeness, for the earth itself was his resting place, the mountains his bones, the rivers his veins, the sky the vault he had held aloft with his own strength. And so the age of Pangu ended as the age of the world began. From that point onward, the earth lay open to the shaping of time, its seasons cycling beneath the watchful sun and moon, its mountains and valleys standing as the enduring testament to the first and greatest of all labors. No living creature yet walked upon it, and the winds moved freely over lands untouched by foot or paw, but the world was ready, prepared in silence for the first stirrings of life, and in that silence there lingered the unspoken truth that all things built on the bones of sacrifice carry within them a debt, one that the beings yet to come would inherit knowingly or not from the giant who had given himself to the making of their world. In the stillness that followed Pangu's passing, the young world lay vast and empty beneath the arch of the sky he had lifted, its rivers whispering over bare stones, its mountains standing sentinel over valleys where no life yet stirred. The winds roamed freely, the rain fell without witness, and the sun and moon traced their courses across a sky unbroken by smoke or wing. It was a realm without voices, without laughter or lament, a place whose beauty was tempered by the weight of its loneliness. For all the wonder in its mountains and plains, it was incomplete for what is a world without. Those two walk upon it. To know it, to give it memory, it was into this silence that she came newer, the mother goddess, the gentle Mina, the weaver of destinies, yet unspun. She was not born as Pangu had been sprung from the breaking of chaos, but arrived as if she had always been wandering the edges of creation, stepping now into a land in need of her hand. Nua walked the breadth of the earth, her eyes lingering on the slow curves of rivers, the sharp lines of ridges, the still glassy lakes that mirrored the sky. She saw beauty, but it was the beauty of an unfinished work, for all its expanse. The land was without music, the forest stood without the rustle of birds, the meadows without the hum of insects. She felt the absence keenly, like an ache in the marrow, and so she resolved to fill the empty world with beings who could tend it, love it, and give it voice in the warm shallows of a riverbank. She knelt and scooped the yellow clay into her hands, feeling its weight and pliancy, its cool dampness yielding beneath her touch. Slowly, with care and precision, she shaped the first of her creations, a figure in her own image, standing upright with eyes to see, a mouth to speak, and hands to work. She breathed into it, and the figure stirred, blinking at the light of a world that had, until that moment, been barren of sight. It took its first breath, and the sound, small, uncertain, was the first voice ever to break the earth's silence. She set the figure upon the ground, and it began to walk its bare feet, leaving the first human tracks in the new soil. Pleased, Nua began to shape others, each unique, some tall, some small, some quick to smile, others grave and slow to speak. Each was given the gift of thought, the ability to remember and to dream. But the work was slow, and Nia's patience was long, yet even she could see that the vastness of the world would take ages to populate at such a pace. So she fashioned a cord, dipped it into the clay, and with a swift motion flung droplets across the land. Where each drop fell, a human sprang to life, some formed of the richest, smoothest clay, who would live in ease, and others born of rougher, coarser clay, who would labor and toil. Thus, in a single day, the earth was no longer empty. From the hills to the plains, humans walked, spoke, and sang their voices, weaving together into the first chorus of mortal life. Noah watched them with quiet pride, her heart warmed by the sight of families forming fires lit against the night, and laughter carrying on the wind. The world at last felt alive. For a time all was well. The people lived under the open sky, drinking from the rivers, gathering fruits and grains, and building their first shelters from branches and mud. They honored Nua, though they did not yet know how to name her, for she had given them life and a land in which to dwell. She moved among them unseen, her presence felt in the gentleness of a summer breeze or the sudden stillness before a storm. Yet the peace of those days was not to last. Far above, in the high halls of heaven, a quarrel among the gods festered and swelled until it burst into open war in its telling. Some say the water god Gong Gong, proud and headstrong, sought dominion over all the realms, defying the will of heaven. Others say it was no more than a contest of honor between him and the fire god Jurong, but whatever its cause, the battle that followed shook both sky and earth. Gong, in his fury at defeat, hurled himself headlong at the Bjo mountain, one of the great pillars that held up the vault of the heavens. His blow was terrible, and the pillar cracked and splintered under the impact in an instant. The order that Pangu had spent his life securing began to unravel. The firmament split, and from the wound in the sky poured sheets of flames, setting forests of light and searing the plains. Rivers swelled and burst their banks as torrents of water gushed down from the breach, drowning villages and fields. Mountains tilted their peaks, shearing away. The sun and moon wavered in their paths, and the stars shuddered in the darkness. The land groaned beneath the weight of the chaos, and the people, small and unprepared, fled to whatever high ground they could find. Beasts, driven mad by fire and flood, roamed the valleys, and the very air was thick with ash and steam. It was as if the young world had been thrown back into the turmoil of its birth. Nua, seeing the peril of her children, felt a grief as deep as the sea and a resolve as unyielding. As the mountains she gathered herself and set to work, for no other power would mend what had been broken. She journeyed to the far corners of the earth, seeking the 5 sacred stones, red, yellow, blue, white, and black, each holding within it the essence of an element. She melted them in a great furnace until their colors bled into one another, forming molten streams of shimmering light with her own hands. She carried this blazing mixture to the rent in the sky and poured it across the wound ceiling, the breach with a patch that shone like a rainbow after a storm still. The heavens swayed, for the fallen pillar lay shattered. Noah sought out the great cosmic turtle, and when she had slain it, she took its 4 massive legs and set them as new pillars at the 4 corners of the earth, steadying the sky once more. Yet her work was not done. The floods still roared, tearing through valleys, and the fires yet raged. She built dams from the ashes of reeds to halt the waters, and with her voice she soothed the flames until they dimmed and died. She drove away the wild beasts that had come with the chaos, sending them back into the deep forests and mountains. Only when the land lay quiet again did she rest her body heavy with exhaustion. Her garments scorched and stained, her hands calloused and burned around her. The people began to emerge from the hills and caves, where they had hidden, gazing in awe at the sky now whole against her, with the soft hues of the stones she had melted. And so the world was saved, not by the wrath of gods or the might of armies, but by the quiet, unyielding labor of one who loved it too deeply to let it fall. Noah asked. No tribute built, no throne demanded, no worship. She returned to her wandering, leaving behind a sky patched with her colors, and a people who, though they would one day forget the details of her deeds, would never forget the sense that above them was a sky that had once been broken, and a mother who had made it whole again. With the wound in the sky sealed and the pillars restored, the young world settled into a fragile peace. The torrents subsided into steady rivers, the fires retreated to the hearts of mountains, and the people whom Noah had shaped from the clay began again to rebuild their homes. Along the banks of streams and in the shelter of hills they planted the first seeds, gathered fruit from the wild groves, and raised their children in a land that bore the marks of catastrophe, yet held within it the promise of renewal. But though the waters had drained and the air had cleared, the scars of the great calamity were everywhere. The earth was uneven now, its plains tilted, its seas stretching further inland than before, and the sky itself, though whole, had taken on a subtle, permanent lean. The sun no longer rose and set from the same place it once had. It drifted toward the west with every day's passing, dragging the stars with it. The people did not understand the cause, but they saw it in the heavens. And in the slow turn of the seasons, they learned that the world had been forever changed by Vahuth. What had passed, no one knew this truth all too well, for it was the cost of her work. The 4 legs of the great turtle she had set as the new pillars of the world were strong enough to bear the weight of heaven, but they were not equal in length, and so the sky now hung at a slight angle. The seas flowed more heavily to the southeast, flooding distant lands, and the rivers ran swifter toward that quarter, carving deep valleys through the earth. The tilt meant that winter's cold pressed harder from the north, while the southern lands grew hotter and wetter. These changes were not merely inconveniences, they reshaped the way the people lived, forcing them to learn the cycles of the altered world and adapt to the new flow of its waters and the harsher turn of its winds. Yet such was the resilience of the humans she had made, that they met this new order with determination, not despair. In the years that followed, Nuwa walked among her children, unseen but ever present, teaching them by subtle guidance rather than open command. It is said she taught them to weave reeds into baskets, to carry grain and fruit, to fire clay into vessels that would hold water against the dry months, and to bind sticks and vines into shelters strong enough to withstand the storms that now swept more fiercely across the land. She gave them the instinct to live not as scattered wanderers, but as communities, to share labor and food, to guard one another against the wild beasts that still prowled the forests, and though she never took a throne among them, her presence was felt in the laws. They began to form rules that mirrored her care for the balance of the world, that punished waste and greed and rewarded those who protected the land and its bounty. But Nuwa was not a goddess without sorrow in her journeys. She would sometimes come upon the bones of those who had perished in the great catastrophe, their bodies swept far from their homes, and she would kneel to cover them with earth, whispering words only the wind could carry away. She saw to the new hardships her children endured under the altered sky, the long winters in the north when the sun's path dipped low and weak, the sudden floods when the swollen rivers, freed from their banks, tore through the villages of the south. She could not undo the tilt she had caused. The world's balance was a delicate thing, and any further meddling might break it beyond repair. Instead, she sought to give her people the tools to endure what she could not change. There are old stories told in the deep countryside of how Enua would appear by the hearth fires of lonely homes, disguised as a weary traveler, and speak of the ways to catch fish in the colder months, to store food in urn pits, so that it would keep through the summer heat, to watch the stars and know when the rains would come. She never lingered, and when she left, the family would find a small gift waiting, perhaps a basket of fruit from a grove that did not grow nearby, or a jug of fresh water, even in the heart of drought. In these quiet acts, she bound herself to her children, not as a ruler binds subjects, but as a mother binds a family through care given freely without thought for thanks. Yet her greatest legacy was not in the tools she gave them or the skills she taught, but in the knowledge that the world itself could be remade when necessity demanded it. The people remembered the day the sky split and the seas rose, and they remembered too that it had been mended not by the will of a council of gods, but by the hands of one who loved them in time. They began to tell the story to their children, who told it to theirs, and with each retelling, the truth of her deeds took root in their hearts, that the earth and the sky were not immutable, that the labors of the few could preserve the lives of the many, and that love, when tempered with resolve, could stand against even the ruin of creation. And so, as the first generations passed into the earth, and their descendants spread further across the land, the colors of her patch in the sky faded into the blue of day and the silver of night. But in the turning of the seasons, in the courses of rivers, and the lean of the heavens, her touch endured. The world she had saved was no longer perfect, but it was alive, and it would endure so long as those who walked upon it remembered that it had once been saved from the brink of destruction. In this way, Nuwa passed quietly into the realm of legend, her name carried on the lips of storytellers, and her image carved into the memory of the people she had made. She did not seek worship, yet in time she would be honored with offerings and prayers, for in the hearts of mortals there grew the understanding that without her the world itself would have been lost in the years after the sky was mended and the waters were made to know their banks again. The people who had been shaped from river clay lived much as beasts live, for, though they had voices and hands and memory, they had not yet learned what to do with these gifts, and so they wandered beneath the sun in small bands that scattered at the first hint of cold rain. They slept in hollows like foxes and ate what they could tear from bush and branch and bone, and when hunger pressed hardest, they quarreled over roots and carrion and the soft eggs of shorebirds. And in their quarrels, there were no laws to separate courage from cruelty, only the brief triumph of the strong and the slow despair of the weak. And in the evenings, when the mist rose from the river mouths, their fires died early because no one knew how to keep a flame alive through the night. It was a world full of daylight, yet poor in knowledge. A season of beginnings without a path, and into this season came Fuxi, who was remembered not for the thunder of his step or the blaze of his eyes, but for the steady patience with which he set his hand upon the wildness of mankind and pressed it toward order as a farmer lays a straight furrow through a stubborn field. And how he did this, the storytellers still recount in a voice that carries both reverence and a kind of solemn gratitude, because the burden of teaching is a quiet burden, and the victories it wins are not sung by war drums, yet they endure beyond the graves of kings he was said to have. The calm of deep water, and the sight of one who reads the shore by the way reeds bend before the wind. And when he walked among the people, he did not stride as a conqueror, he listened, he watched, and he learned where hunger bit deepest, and where fear most often made men cruel. And from that knowledge he began with the smallest of mercies, for he taught them to keep a coal alive at dawn, and to nurse it until it answered with a steady flame. And then he showed them that meat need not be torn raw from the bone, but could be laid upon stones warmed in the fire, so that its fibers softened and its juices fed strength rather than sickness. And those who tasted such food felt a kind of miracle in their limbs, the slow fever of parasites fading, the dull ache in their bellies easing. And with that single change the people found that days lengthened, because they did not spend every hour hunting for the next mouthful, and nights softened because the fire kept teeth and cold at a respectful distance. When he had secured the stomach, he turned to the hands, for he saw men and women clawing at streams for fish, and coming up with little more than slime and bruised pride. And he took vine and fibre, and with patient fingers tied them in a pattern that imitated the lattice of reeds along the banks. And he dragged that woven thing through the water and lifted it, heavy with silver bodies that writhed like a living rope. And the people saw that thought could multiply strength, and they called this knowledge a blessing, because it made wealth from motion and patience, and not merely from brood speed from riverbanks. He climbed to the fields that waited in silence for a master, and there he taught them not to scour a hillbed for one greedy day, but to watch the seasons and read the clouds and place seeds in the dark at the right time, so that the earth would answer with green that did not exhaust itself in a single meal. And to do this well, he set them to shaping wood into handles and stone into edges, and he made the first tools that split soil and turned it. And he spoke to them of tending animals rather than chasing them. And soon there were goats that no longer bolted at a footfall, and dogs that slept by the doorway instead of snapping at heels. And from these simple accords between man and beast came milk in the mornings, and guarded nights, and skins tanned against the winter. And if there were failures and lean years, he did not hide them. He taught the people to keep count, to set aside grain when the harvest was kind, to ask the sky for mercy when it was not, and to learn from both fortune and misfortune. With equal humility, as the people gathered in steadier camps, he knew that hunger was no longer the only wolf among them, for where men live close together, fear and desire become quick to anger. And so Fuxi set his mind to binding not only reeds and nets, but also the restless heart of man, and he did this by giving names to bonds that had been shifting as mist. He spoke of marriage as a rope willingly tied between two. He spoke of kin as branches on a single trunk. He forbade the taking of a woman by force and the stealing of a neighbor's stores in the hunger of night. And he set punishments for those who would not listen, not out of cruelty, but out of a colder wisdom, for he saw that a village cannot grow where every hand mistrusts the next. The people who had once met only in the clash of hunger now met in the circle of a common fire, and at that fire, Foxy taught them to remember the day's work and to promise the next day's work with words that bound like cords, and he taught them to sing so that the children would learn the words quickly and keep them true. And he taught them to bury their dead with care, so that grief would not sour into fear of the dark places, and he taught them to lift their eyes at dawn and offer the first smoke of the cooking fire to the high powers, for he knew that men who think only of themselves soon become beasts again, but men who allow awe to live in them will hold their hands steadier on the plough and their tempers longer at the council stone. In time there were clans where there had been wandering families. There were councils where there had been brawls, and the people who had once drifted like leaves on a flood now set posts in the ground and measured distance not as hazards to be crossed, but as fields to be tended and paths to be walked by friends who bring news, and salt order does not come without resistance. And there were those who mocked the cords of marriage and raided granaries by moonlight and laughed at the notion that an oath could be stronger than a spear, and Foxy met them not with thunder but with a slow and unyielding justice that turned back cruelty like a wall turns back the sea. He made restitution the first rule and exile the last, and where blood had been spilled he demanded more than grief. He demanded that the clan take responsibility for the wound it had inflicted upon the fabric of the village, and he would stand in the market circle with his staff grounded in dust and speak until anger cooled and men remembered that their children would drink from the same well tomorrow and next year, and in the winter after that. Little by little the fear that had governed their nights gave way to a different discipline, the discipline that comes from knowing one's place and one's duty, and trusting that the same law will be applied to friend and rival alike. And under such a roof of fairness, the first tendernesses of culture began to grow. Like moss in shade, the zither's notes trembling over dusk stories traded for a bowl of millet, a carved figure of antler left on a stone by the river, simply because it pleased the carver to see it there when he returned from his nets. When the land had been coaxed into giving more than it took, and the houses had learned to stand in rows like ranks of saplings, Foxy set his sight beyond the day and the harvest, and the quarrel mended. He stared long at the river until its surface stilled, and it gave back to him not his own face, but the suggestion of a pattern that lay beneath faces and names, and he understood that if fire and water and mountain and thunder had voices, they would speak in a language simpler and older than any he had taught, and he resolved to teach that language to his people in signs they could carry in their heads and scratch upon wood by lamplight, and that labor belongs to another telling. For now it is enough to say that by his hands the wildness of men was gentled, without being broken their bellies were filled without making them soft, their courage was turned from cruelty toward guardianship, and their days began to sit in a row like stones laid across a stream so that a traveler can cross without drowning, when the hunger of the people had been yoked and the temper of the villagers had been taught to wear the bridle of law, when the fields answered seed with grain, and the market stones were warmed each evening by the murmur of familiar voices. Foxy's gaze lifted from the furrow and the hearth to the larger question that had haunted him since the first net drew silver from the river, for he knew that the work of a lifetime can be undone by a winter that comes early, or a river that rises without warning, and he understood that a people who do not learn to read the great face of the world are like sailors rowing with their backs to the sea, and so he sought not only to teach the hands of men, but to school their eyes and their minds, to give them a grammar by which the earth and sky might be read the way a shepherd reads the back of a weathered hand. He went alone to the bends of the yellow river where the banks were laid, bare like ribs, and the current muttered under its breath. And there he waited through dawns that smelled of wet clay and nights that carried the cold glitter of fires, and on a morning when the mist sat low on the water like breath on a mirror, the surface broke and a creature rose that was neither horse nor dragon, yet had the grace of both a living cipher whose scaled back bore a lattice of dark and light, as if the river had ridden upon it, and the beast did not speak with a mouth, but passed by, and left the pattern in Foxy's mind as clearly as footprints in fresh silt. And in that moment the chieftain understood that the world does not shout its truths, it arranges them. He returned to the people, carrying nothing in his hands and everything in his head, and he began to draw lines upon scraped bark and smoothed bone, a simple music of whole and broken strokes that stood for yes and no, for yielding and firm, for dark and bright, for the two great currents that flow beneath every quarrel and every courtship and every storm. And from pairs he built triplets, until 8 figures stood before his council like 8 ancient elders whose advice never contradicts itself. And he named these figures not with pomp, but with uses: heaven and earth, thunder and wind, water and fire, mountain and lake, so that even a child who had watched weather from the doorway would understand that this was not sorcery dressed in silk, but the very scaffolding of the days. And with these signs he taught them to cast stalks and count changes, to ask not whether fortune would come like a hawk from the sun, but how to meet what was already walking toward them from the horizon. And in time the diver's mat became a place where farmers and fishermen learned the cleverness of patience, where counselors tasted the bitter root of certainty and chose prudence instead, where warriors were reminded that the fiercest stroke is useless if delivered against the grain of the hour. When the village faced a choice between clearing a forest spur or turning the ploughlands toward the river flats, the elders did not merely argue their appetites, they sat with the trigrams and listened for the mute counsel of the season. And many a disaster was avoided because the people had been given a way to consider more than their temper. From the same well of pattern he drew other gifts, for the mind that learns to see the hidden seams of a thing is soon tempted to stitch. And so Foxy gathered the old scratches and tally marks with which hunters had once kept count of birds and days, and he wove them into signs that could carry a name beyond the reach of a voice. And the people learned that memory could be made to live in wood and bone, that a message could walk farther than feet, that a promise scratched upon a tablet would outlast anger, and that a song written down would be sung again by someone who had never seen the singer's face. And though the first script was crude and changed with each passing season, it was a bridge thrown over the river that lies between the living and the yet unborn, and the clans who crossed it became different from the clans that would not, because they learned to keep a lineage of thought, and not only of blood. And because he understood that a world ordered only by rules becomes a cage, he set a zither on his knees at nightfall and drew from its strings a line of sound as clear as ice water, the first deliberate music that was not a cry of warning or a lull to keep a child from tears, but a making for its own sake. And the notes went out over the dark like lanterns and came back gentled, and the people found that the same patterns that guided seed and storm could guide fingers and breath. And soon there were rhythms for planting, measures for morning airs that called men to counsel, and airs that let the hard days slip from the shoulders as a cloak slips from a peg. And with music came a calmer kind of courage, the courage to endure an answer one does not like, and to keep faith with a winter that promises nothing, but asks for everything. He did not hoard these arts like jewels to be displayed only in his tent. He gave them away like water, showing the youngest 2 line, the trigrams along the edge of a game board, so that play might teach them what sermons could not, teaching the steadiest among the elders to keep a book of judgments, so that law would not be a wind that shifts when a chieftain's mood turns, asking the keenest eyes to watch the backs of clouds and the habits of birds, so that the calendar would be a servant of the fields and not a tyrant of the hearth. And in each gift there was a darker twin, a caution that every pattern tempts the proud to mistake it for fate. And so he reminded his divers that the lines only show the grain, and that the hand must still choose how to plane the plank. He reminded his scribes that words can bind and also blind. When men loved the letter more than the thing it names, he reminded his musicians that melody is a guest and grows weary in a hall. That is too ornate. In this way he guarded the village from the sicknesses that come with cleverness, and he did it without the sting of contempt, for he knew that vanity is cured better by laughter and attention to work than by lectures that leave a bruise in his last years, when the trigrams had become a second hearth in every settlement, and the first stitched records had begun to accumulate in baskets of plaited bark. Foxy sat again by the yellow river and listened to its many tongues. The roar over stones, the whisper at a ford, the silence where it widened and moved like a great beast asleep, and he understood that his time as the hand that guides had reached its proper end, for there were other gifts. The people needed gifts, not of pattern and sin, but of earth and leaf and fever, broken by a bitter brew, and the work of teaching those gifts would belong to another with a different fire in his blood. He rose without ceremony and walked back through fields that had once been untamed scrub, and through streets where children chased one another under door lintels, carved with the simplest of characters, and the people watched him pass with the quiet love reserved for those whose names will be spoken softly at night, long after their bones have settled. And when at last he was gone from their sight, the river kept on speaking, and the wind kept on worrying the reeds, and the 8 old figures waited patiently on the diver's mat for the next question, as they would for 1,000 years and 1,000 more, while the nation that did not yet know its own name learned how to stand upright under heaven, without forgetting that heaven has rules that even kings must obey. After Foxy's long reign came to its quiet close, the world passed into the hands of another sovereign, whose nature was different, yet whose purpose was no less great. This was Shannon, the divine farmer, remembered in the old stories as the man who carried the strength of an ox in his shoulders, and the patience of the soil in his heart, where Foxy had tamed the wildness of men and given them the structure to live together without tearing each other apart. Shannon turned his gaze to the earth itself, for he saw that the people still lived at the mercy of chance. A bad season could bring famine no law could cure, and the memory of a generous harvest was little comfort when the cold months came, lean and unforgiving. Shannon understood that a people chained to the fortune of the hunt or the fickle mood of the wild grove would never be free to build a lasting world. His task would be to teach them how to draw their strength from the land itself, to make the earth not merely a stage for their lives, but a partner in their survival. He began with the simplest truth, that the soil, if coaxed with the right hand, could yield food in greater measure than the forests or rivers ever would. He walked the fields and low valleys, studying the lay of the land, the turn of the wind, and the flow of the streams that swelled in the rains and shrank in the summer heat. He fashioned the first ploughs from bent wood, hardened in fire, lashed with cord and tipped with sharpened stone. In his own hands he showed the people how to press these tools into the soil, turning it so the hidden richness beneath the surface could breathe and take the seed under his guidance. They planted millet, barley, and rice, learning to scatter the grain, not in desperate handfuls, but in measured rows, that the earth could nourish evenly. Shannon's work was not a gift given in an afternoon. It was a slow discipline, learned with blistered palms and aching backs. He taught them to clear the stones from the furrows to pull weeds, before they stole the life from the young shoots, to watch the skies for the signs of rain, and to know when the sun's strength would harden the soil beyond use in the hills. He showed them where to terrace the slopes, so the earth would not wash away, and in the valleys. He taught them to cut channels that carried water to the fields during dry weeks. As the seasons turned under his eye, the fields began to answer their labor with gold and green, and for the first time in living memory, the stores were heavy enough to outlast the winter. Hunger still came, for no land is without its curses, but it no longer ruled them as it had before. With food came stability, and with stability came trade. Shannon gathered the scattered clans into places where the paths crossed and the rivers met, and there he set the first markets. People brought grain, meat, tools, and cloth to exchange, and under his watch these gatherings became more than trade. They became the heartbeat of the young nation. Songs were traded, along with Baska's news traveled with jars of millet wine, and the sense grew that they were no longer only scattered villages, but parts of a whole. Shannon also brought the people the calendar of the 24 solar terms, marking the changes in the sun's path and the breath of the seasons with it. Farmers could prepare for planting before the rains began, and harvest before the frosts returned. The land was still a living thing, untamed and unpredictable, but with the knowledge he gave them, they could stand before it as partners rather than beggars. By the end of the first decades of his reign, the marks of his work were written into the land itself. Hills bore the steps of terrace fields, valleys were crossed by canals, and the markets bustled with the hum of voices that no longer feared the lean months. But Shannon's eyes were not satisfied with fields heavy with grain or stores filled with baskets. He saw another hunger still gnawing at the people, a hunger that grain could not ease, a hunger born of illness when the body weakens, and no storehouse of food can bring it back to strength. And in this hunger, Shannon recognized his next great task. Shannon's fields had brought the people a measure of safety from famine, but he knew the earth could not shield them from every enemy. Sickness crept through the villages in every season. In summer, fevers burned in the bodies of children and left them too weak to rise. In autumn, unseen poisons hid in the bright berries and strange mushrooms that tempted the hungry. Winter brought coughs that racked the lungs and left the breath shallow, while spring brought biting insects whose venom could turn blood sour. No tool of wood or stone could keep these afflictions away. For all their newfound strength, the people were still at the mercy of the unseen. Shannon, who had already given them the knowledge to tame the soil, decided he would tame this enemy as well. He turned to the wild growths of the earth, for he believed that if the land could nourish life, it could also heal it. Traveling alone, at first he walked the ridges, the riverbanks, and the shaded glens where moss gathered. He carried no weapon save for a small blade to cut stems and roots, and he worked with the patience of a man planting an orchard, whose fruit he may never live to taste. Whenever he found a plant unknown to him, he boiled it, chewed it, crushed it in his palm, or drank its juice. Some left a clean, sharp taste and eased the aches in his own body. Others burned his tongue, blackened his lips, or sent fire into his veins. The people whispered that his body was unlike theirs, that his belly was made of crystal, so he could watch the path of the plant spirit through him. Whether this was truth or the embroidery of storytellers, it is certain that Shannon was willing to pay the price for every discovery himself. Day after day he tasted roots in the shadow of the mountains, leaves in the heat of the southern forests, and fungi that grew only on rotting wood in the darkest parts of the valleys. He mapped them in his memory, their colors, their shapes, the soil. They preferred the seasons. When they were strongest, he tested them on the sick, bringing bitter teas to those in the grip of fever pickuses, to those whose wounds had begun to sour, and smoke from dried leaves to ease The breath of the coughing in this way cures began to replace prayers whispered in desperation. Children who would have withered in their mother's arms lived to run in the fields. Hunters who would have been left to die after a snake bite returned to the hunt, but every cure carried a shadow. Some plant struck him down with blinding pain or stopped his heart until it beat again in a stuttering rhythm. Once high in the western hills, he bit into a stalk that sent a cold fire through his body, so swiftly that his legs failed him and he fell among the stones. The old tales say that, as his vision dimmed, a breeze shook the leaves of a tea plant growing nearby. A few fell onto his lips, and in his final breath of strength, he chewed them. The bitterness chased away the poison, and his life returned. Whether the tale is true or not, the tea plant became a gift he passed on to the people, a drink to clear the head and steady the body. By the end of his long search, Shennong had learned the use of hundreds of plants. He taught the people how to boil bark to draw out its healing strength, how to mash leaves to clean a wound, how to brew roots into tonics that would strengthen the blood. He gathered this knowledge into a great catalogue, a record that was carried in memory, and in the words of those he trained in it were plants for hunger, for pain, for the poison of insects, and for the darkness that sometimes came over a man's mind. With this knowledge, healers began to appear in every settlement, men and women who could walk into the wild return with green stalks and dried flowers, and turn them into remedies that gave the people more years of life than they had ever known before. Shennong's reign became one of both nourishment and recovery. The earth under his care fed the people, and its plants healed them. He was not a warlord or a king of courts. His power came from the steady proof of his work. The people remembered that before his time, they had lived from season to season with the fear of famine and the certainty that illness would one day come for them. Under him, they learned that both the field and the forest could be made to serve them if approached with knowledge and patience. When he was gone, the tools he had given them, the plough, the market, the calendar, the healing leaf remained, and though the seasons would still turn with storms and droughts, and though death would still find its way into every life, they would never again be as helpless as they had once been. After Shennong's death, the land he had nurtured did not fall into ruin. The ploughs still turned the soil, the market still rang with barter, and the healers still walked into the forests in search of new cures. But the peace he had built was a fragile one, for the clans that filled the valleys and plains were many, and the ties that bound them together were thin. Each had its own customs, its own chieftains, and its own pride in the absence of a single hand to steady them. Rivalries began to grow, disputes over borders and rivers turned to skirmishes, and the skirmishes became wars. Into this unrest was born a leader unlike any the land had yet seen. Xuanyuan Huangdi, Yellow Emperor. His name would one day be spoken as the forefather of a people, but in the beginning he was only one more chieftain among many ruling over the Yukon clan. In the hills of the northwest, the Yellow Emperor was not the tallest or the strongest among the chieftains, but he was the most deliberate. He watched the ways of his neighbors, the rise and fall of their fortunes, and the mistakes that brought them low. He understood that a tribe could win a battle and still lose the war if its strength was wasted. When his scouts brought him word that the Flame Emperor Yandi was pressing his claim to the fertile heartlands, Hangdi did not rush to meet him in blind defiance. Instead, he measured his strength against the task, gathering allies from the smaller clans who had grown weary of Yandi's dominance. The clash came at Bank 1, where the rivers met in a plain ringed by low hills. The fighting lasted for days, with neither side yielding. Easily Hang's discipline and planning won the field, but instead of crushing Yandi entirely, he offered him terms. It was a choice, born not from mercy, but from foresight. Hangi understood that a defeated rival could be more useful as an ally than as a memory. Yandi accepted the truce, and the two leaders bound their clans. Together, this union gave them the strength to face a far greater threat than 9 Li tribes under the warlord Kaio. Kaio was a terror in both body and mind, a commander whose warriors were as fierce as wolves and as relentless as the storm. Some said he had the head of a bull and the body of bronze, that no weapon could pierce his hide and no chain could bind. His people, were masters of metal forging blades and armor that outmatched the bone and stone of their enemies. They descended on the central plains with fire and blood driving all before them. Hangi and Yandi knew that if they fell separately, Kaio would scatter their people and rule the heartland unchallenged. Together they gathered their warriors, calling on every ally from the hills. The valleys and the far river mouths, the armies met on the marshy fields of Julu, a place where the ground could suck the life from a man's legs before he ever reached the enemy. Kaio came with numbers beyond counting his banners. Black with the symbols of his clan, the opening days belonged to him. He conjured a fog so thick that men stumbled into their own ranks and died by the hands of their allies. Panic spread. Hangdi's lines began to break it. Was then that the Yellow Emperor revealed his greatest weapon, not a blade or a bow, but the south-pointing chariot, a creation of cunning gears and magnets that always showed the way. Guided by this device, his soldiers found their bearings in the choking mist. Regaining their order, they pressed forward. Hangdi called on the Xuanyu tribe women who fought with drums and horns, whose sound could unsettle the bravest foe. Their thunder rolled over the marsh, breaking the rhythm of Kaio's advance. The warlord answered with storms of wind and rain, but Hangdi had prepared for that as well. He invoked the aid of the drought goddess Ba, whose presence withered the clouds and stilled the rain. The dragon Ying Long swooped from the skies, scattering the last of the fog with the beating of its wings. With the field clear, the fighting turned. Brutal spears clashed, shields shattered, and the marsh ran dark with blood. Kaio fought at the center, cutting down all who came near it. Took the combined effort of Hangdi's champions to bring him down. When he was bound at last, he roared with such fury that the earth itself seemed to tremble. Hangdi ordered his execution, knowing that to leave him alive would only invite more war. The victory at Tsuelu was absolute, but it had been paid for in the lives of thousands. The bodies of the dead lay in the mare for days before the survivors could bury them. In the wake of that battle, Hangdi became more than a war leader. He became the architect of a nation. He set down laws to bind the clans together, built roads to join the far corners of the realm, and called to his courtmen of skill. An invention under his reign, new tools were forged, better shelters raised, and the first steps taken toward a shared identity. Silk was spun in the halls of his Queen Lu, and the people began to clothe themselves in garments that would last beyond a single season. The Yellow Emperor ruled for decades, guiding the realm through years of peace and years of trial, always with the same steady purpose. By the time he neared the end of his life, the tribes that had once fought over every riverbank and hunting ground were united under a single banner. Legends say that he did not die as other men do, but rose into the sky on the back of a dragon, disappearing into the clouds. Whether this was truth or the dream of later ages, his passing marked the end of an era. The land he left behind was stronger than it had ever been, yet it would need all that strength for what was to come. For though the wars of men had quieted, there were still forces in the world that could shake the pillars of heaven itself. The marshes of Zualu had scarcely dried before the story of Hangdi's victory over Siawa spread across the land to the people of the Central Plains. He became not just a ruler, but a figure of destiny, the one who had united the clans and broken the power of the most feared warlord in memory. Yet the work of uniting a people is never finished with a single victory. The Yellow Emperor knew that the peace forged at Julu was fragile old. Rivalries still smoldered. Tribes that had bent the knee in the shadow of his army would need reason to remain loyal when the drums of war fell silent. The land he had claimed was vast, stretching from the river valleys to the mountain ranges, and distance could turn obedience into forgetfulness. To keep the realm whole, he would have to give the people more than a common enemy. He would have to give them a common life. Hangi turned first to the building of a capital that could serve as the heart of his domain. He chose a place where rivers met and trade could flow, where the land was fertile enough to feed armies and artisans alike. From this center he began to weave his empire together. Roads were cut through hills and across valleys, linking far villages to the capital. Messengers rode from one end of the realm to the other, carrying news orders and the beginnings of a shared law. Markets grew along these routes, places where goods from the mountains could be traded for grain. From the plains and silk from the workshops of Lazu's weavers in the quiet years that followed Julu, invention thrived. Hangdi gathered to his court men and women of skill, those who could shape metal, read the stars, or turn the strength of the wind and water to useful ends. From these minds came the refinement of the bow, the improvement of farming tools, and the crafting of stronger shelters. The art of writing, which some say began with kanji in Hangdi's own service, began to take shape, allowing records to be kept, treaties to be written, and the memory of the realm to stretch beyond the life of a single generation. Music too was given form, with instruments tuned to mark the rhythms of planting, harvest, and festival. Even as his court busied itself with craft and governance, Hangdi did not forget the lessons of war. He reformed the armies, organizing them into disciplined ranks, and established signal towers so that word of any threat could race across the land faster than an enemy could march. The borders were guarded, but he sought not constant battle, preferring to secure alliances through marriage and negotiation. When he could, in this way, the realm's stability deepened. The years gathered into decades, and the Yellow Emperor's reign became a time of memory for those who had known only conflict before. Yet for all his achievements, Hangdi never ruled as though the world would stay as it was. He understood that power fades if it rests too long in one hand without purpose. In his later years, he began to withdraw from the day-to-day affairs of the court, allowing his successors to learn the burdens of command. While he turned his thoughts toward the legacy he would leave, he saw in the unity of the realm the chance for something greater than himself. A nation bound by shared law, shared craft, and shared memory. When at last his time came, it was said he did not go to the earth like other men. Some told that a great dragon descended from the clouds, coiling around him as the court watched, and carried him into the heavens. Others said he simply walked into the mists of the mountains and never returned. However it happened, his passing was not seen as an ending, but as a transformation, the fading of a mortal leader into a figure who would belong to the realm forever. The banners of his clan were lowered, but the roads he built, the laws he set, and the unity he forged endured. Under his successors, the empire he had shaped would face new challenges, some born from within, others from the vast powers beyond its borders. Yet his reign stood as a high mark in the memory of the people. The age when the clans of the Central Plains became one, and though the heavens had been steady through his time, the old stories warned that even the strongest pillars could be shaken. The gods, like men, were not without ambition, and their quarrels had a way of spilling into the world below. After the Yellow Emperor's passing, the realm he had built did not fall to pieces, as so many kingdoms had after the death of their founders. The roads he had carved across the land still carried traders and messengers from one province to the next. The laws he had set down were still spoken in the courts of the chieftains, and the memory of Zalu still bound the great clans together in a shared pride. Yet unity is not a thing that can be left unattended. It must be guarded and renewed, or it begins to fray at the edges. And in the years that followed his departure, old rivalries and ambitions began to stir once more. It was in this time that the mantle of leadership passed to his grandson, Emperor Wanshu. He was not a man of war like Hanged, nor a wanderer and inventor like Fukai and Shenong before him. His gift was a colder one, the ability to see the realm as a web of obligations and powers, and to strengthen that web until it could not be easily torn. He inherited a land that was rich but restless. In the valleys new villages had risen there, fields stretching further each year into what had once been wild ground. In the mountains, small tribes still kept to their old ways, bowing to the emperor in word, but not always in deed. The rivers carried trade, but they also carried whispers of unrest. Xuanchu set himself to the work of binding these scattered lands into a single order. He began with the rites. Each season, sacrifices to heaven, earth, and the spirits of soil and grain were to be made, not as the whim of a village demanded, but according to a calendar kept in the capital. Music too was to be made, orderly, its notes fixed to scales that would be recognized from the northern hills to the southern plains. These were not idle matters to Juanyunu, a people who sang the same songs and prayed on the same days, would think of themselves as one people, not as 100 small nations huddled together for convenience. He also turned his attention to the shape of the family. For generations, many clans had passed leadership through the mother's line, the women holding the memory of the family and the authority over its alliances. Yanu saw in this a source of division. He declared that succession should pass from father to son, and that the household should be bound under a single patriarch. This change did not come easily, for it struck at the oldest roots of custom. Yet in time, it brought a new clarity to the order of inheritance and allegiance. But it was not only the mortal order that concerned Huan Shu. In those days, the sky and the earth were not as far apart as they are now. The stories say that, in the age before his rule, gods, spirits, and other beings walked freely among men. Some brought wisdom or aid, others brought chaos. There were tribes, most famously the Miao, who learnt the arts of magic and used them not to protect their people, but to bend them to their will through fear. Rumors told of chieftains who called storms down upon their enemies, who sent plagues into rival villages, and who dared to defy the laws of heaven itself. Jiang Shu judged that such traffic between the realms was dangerous, so long as gods and spirits moved at will among mortals. No law could be secure, no peace lasting, and so he made a decision as bold as it was irreversible. He would sever the path between heaven and earth. He summoned 2 great ministers, Chong and Li, and charged them with this task: the ancient roads between the realms, the ladders of cloud, the great trees whose roots touched the underworld and whose branches brushed the sky. The unseen paths known only to shamans were destroyed or closed. Where once a mortal might climb to the gates of heaven, or a spirit descend to walk among the living, there was now only distance and silence. It was not done without sorrow. There were those among his court who feared the loss of the wisdom the immortals sometimes brought there. Were shamans, who had been trusted advisors to their tribes, who found themselves suddenly deaf to the voices they had served all their lives. But Huanu stood firm in his mind. A world ruled by men should be governed by men's laws, not the unpredictable whims of beings who answered to no mortal order. When the work was done, the sky seemed a little higher, the stars a little farther away. Dreams became the only path left to reach the divine, and even those were fleeting and uncertain. The gods were not gone, but they were now distant, and their favor or wrath came not through conversation, But through signs in the wind, the harvest, and the flight of birds, some called it a loss, others a necessary shield for the first time. Mankind stood alone, under heaven, bound together by the structures they themselves had built. Shu reigned. For many years after that, and the peace he had secured held the tribes grew into provinces, the provinces into a realm, whose people shared not only roads and markets, but rights and laws, and though he never fought a battle as famous as Zulu, his legacy was no less enduring. He had drawn the boundaries not only of the land but of the cosmos itself, fixing the place of men and gods, so that each might keep to its own realm. With the paths between heaven and earth severed, the world settled into a new shape, one in which mortals were left to govern themselves, without the constant presence of divine visitors. But peace of this kind is never simple. In the first years after the closing, the land seemed quieter. No strange lights moved down from the clouds, no wandering immortals appeared in the markets to trade riddles for grain, and no great beasts slipped from the mountains carrying the smell of the other world. Yet the silence brought with it an unease, for the people were not accustomed to such distance from the powers they had once seen and feared. Some felt abandoned. Others feared the gods would return in wrath. Shamans and spirit talkers, once the keepers of wisdom, found their voices empty. Shu understood that this gap could not remain unfilled. If the gods no longer walked among men to enforce the order of the world, then the order would have to come from men themselves. He turned his mind to building a structure of law and authority that could stand where the ladders to heaven had once been. His rule was methodical. Each province was bound more closely to the center through appointed governors, loyal to the throne, chosen not only for blood or lineage, but for the ability to maintain peace and collect tribute without driving the people to rebellion. The laws that had once varied from clan to clan were made uniform, written in a clear hand, and carried by messengers to every corner of the realm. Those laws were no longer commands whispered by divine envoys. They were the word of the emperor himself, backed by his right to rule and the unity he had inherited from his grandfather. He reformed the system of tribute so that it was not merely a measure of wealth, but a way to bind the provinces to the heart of the realm. Grain cloth and crafted tools flowed toward the capital, and in return, the emperor's protection, resources, and favor flowed. Back markets in the outer provinces began to see goods from distant lands carried along the same roads that bore the emperor's decrees. This exchange created a network of obligation and prosperity. A farmer in the far north might never see the emperor's face, but he would feel the reach of his rule. In the grain weights stamped with the imperial seal, in the festivals kept on the same days as in the capital, in the patrols that kept the roads clear of bandits. But even as he bound the land together, Shu knew that the memory of the old ways lingered. The Miao tribes, whose misuse of spiritual power had helped drive him to close the gates of heaven, still lived in the southern mountains. Cut off from the divine currents they had once commanded, they clung to their old rites, whispering the names of spirits now too far to hear their leaders, resisted the emperor's authority, holding to their own laws and their own gods. Shu did not march against them in open war, for he knew that such a conflict would bleed the realm and harden their defiance. Instead, he sent envoys bearing gifts and promises, binding some of their leaders to him through marriage alliances and trade. Slowly their isolation frayed. When the reign of Shu came to its end, the realm he left behind was ordered and secure, its borders held by loyal governors, its markets bound together by roads and tribute, its laws fixed in the minds of those who lived under them. Yet the stillness he had cultivated could not last forever. Order in the mortal world, no matter how carefully maintained, was always vulnerable to the tempers of the sky. and the shifting of the earth in the decades that followed the throne passed to new hands, and in time it came to Yao, a man whose name would be carried through the ages not as a conqueror's, but as the model of the wise and virtuous ruler. His court was not a place of glittering excess, but of measured governance, and his judgment was sought not only in matters of law, but in the disputes of clans, the division of land, and the setting of the calendar. His rule was remembered as a golden age, yet it was a golden age hammered into shape by trials that would have broken lesser kings. The first of these came from the heavens themselves. In the early years of Yao's reign, the balance of the sky was shattered. It is told that in those days, the sun was not a solitary master of the daylight, but one among 10 brothers, each a fiery 3-legged crow that took its turn crossing the heavens for untold years. They had kept to their cycle, one rising as the others rested, each giving the land its measured share of light and warmth, but whether from boredom, mischief, or some quarrel among themselves, the 10 rose together one morning, and the world was drowned in their combined fire. The sky blazed white, the rivers shrank to cracked beds, the forests smouldered, and the fields withered. Where they stood, livestock died in the shade, and men fell in the open with their throats to dry to cry for water. Yao did not meet this calamity with empty prayers alone. He sent word across the realm for Hu Ye, a master archer whose skill was known even in the farthest provinces. Ho Ye came at the emperor's call, carrying a great bow of mulberry wood and arrows tipped with white feathers. From the highest peak he called out to the sons, pleading with them to return to their proper order, but they would not listen. They laughed from their high seats in the sky, their heat searing the mountain tops. Seeing that mercy would not be given, Hoi knocked his first arrow and let it fly. The shaft tore through the air and struck one of the crows from the sky, sending it tumbling in a trail of smoke and fire. One by one he brought down 9 of the 10, until only the last remained. As he drew his bow once more, Yao himself stayed his hand, for the world could not live without. At least one Sunday, Ho Yi lowered the weapon, and the lone survivor fled chastened to follow its proper path. The people were saved from the burning, but the scars remained. The rivers took seasons to swell again, the soil years to recover its strength. In the wake of the fire came new dangers. Creatures driven from their burned homes roamed the plains and hills, preying on the weak. How the still in Yao's service hunted many of these great serpents that had taken to swallowing cattle whole and beasts with claws like bronze that prowled at night. Yet even as the land healed from the sun's wrath, another greater trial began to stir, one that would test the endurance of every soul in the realm. It began with heavy rains, steady at first, then relentless rivers swelled and spilled into the fields. Villagers abandoned the low ground, retreating to the slopes, but the water followed them. The rains did not stop when the season turned. They did not stop the next year or the year after. The waters joined together into a vast rowing flood that seemed to have no source and no end, swallowing valleys and hills alike. Those who survived lived on narrow strips of high ground, fishing from the roofs of their old homes and moving by raft from place to place. The order that Yao had worked to preserve began to break under the weight of despair. The emperor sought counsel from his wisest ministers, and all agreed that the flood must be met with a leader who could command both the labor of men and the will of heaven. Yao chose Gun, a man of bold ambition and a descendant of the royal line of Shuanggu. Gun believed he could contain the waters by building great walls and dikes, hemming in the rivers until they were forced to remain in their courses. He sought out a miraculous substance known as zaring, a self-growing soil said to have been guarded by the supreme deity himself, and whether by request or theft he came into possession of it. With this he raised embankments higher than any the people had seen before for 9 years. Gun labored, driving his workers to build wall upon wall, yet the waters did not yield. They rose behind his barriers until the pressure broke them, sending walls of water into the land with greater force than before. Villages were washed away in moments, fields were stripped bare. The people began to lose faith not only in guns' methods, but in Yao's choice to entrust him with the task. The flood was not only a disaster of water, but of spirit, and even in the highlands, where the waters could not reach, hunger stalked the people. Yao, seeing the failure, knew that the work was too great for his own lifetime. He looked to the question of succession with a clear eye. Though he had sons of his own, he chose not to pass the throne to them. Instead, he turned to a man named Shun, born of humble stock, whose reputation for honesty and fairness had spread far beyond his small village. Shun had been tested in the administration of irrigation works and in settling disputes among the provinces, and he had shown a rare gift for inspiring loyalty without force. Yao made him Karula, hoping that the floods might be mastered in the next reign. In the last years of his life, Yao watched Shun take the burden of rule and felt the satisfaction of knowing the realm was in steady hands. He died with the flood still raging, but with the belief that the man he had chosen would finish the work he could not, and so the golden age of his reign, tempered by fire and water, came to its close. Not with collapse, but with the passing of the torch to a successor who would face the greatest trial the realm had yet endured. Shun came to the throne in a world still half drowned. The floods that had begun in Yao's reign showed no sign of retreat, and the land wore its wounds openly. Whole provinces were scattered across hilltops and ridges, their fields abandoned beneath the shifting inland sea. Villages clung to the high ground like barnacles on stone. Linked by precarious causeways of logs, and rope trade was carried in narrow boats over the roofs of submerged homes, and the people measured their days by the sound of rushing water in the valleys below. The air itself seemed changed, thick with the smell of silt and decay, heavy with the endless weight of rain clouds. Even the sun, when it managed to pierce the gloom, seemed pale. And reluctant Shun inherited not only the throne, but a task that had broken the will of those who came before him. His first act was to face the matter of Gun. For 9 long years, Gun had worked to contain the flood by building ever greater dikes, trusting in Zerang to grow and hold against the force of the water. But the rivers had defied him, and the flood had grown worse for his efforts. The embankments were not barriers, they were traps that, when broken, unleashed ruin far swifter than before. Gun's pride was as high as the walls he built, and he would not yield his command. Even in failure, Shun summoned him to court and listened to his defense. But in the end, the decision was clear. Gun was stripped of his authority and sent into exile on Feather Mountain. Some say he perished there. By the decree of heaven, his body transformed into a yellow bear before disappearing into the mists. Others claim he wandered until death claimed him quietly. Whatever the truth, his fall was as complete as his failure. Shun did not rush to replace him with another man of similar mind. He understood that the same approach would yield the same ruin. He turned to Yu, the son of Gun, a man who had grown up in the shadow of his father's stubbornness, but had learned from his mistakes. Yu had served as one of Gun's assistants, traveling the breadth of the floodlands and seeing with his own eyes how the waters moved. He had come to believe that they could not be stopped by force. Instead, they must be given paths to follow, channels to draw them harmlessly to the sea. Where Gun had sought to command the rivers, Yu would bargain with them, shaping their course rather than defying their will. The task he faced was colossal. The flood was not the work of a single river out of its banks, but of many, each swollen and unruly, feeding into one another until the entire land seemed to flow. You began with the rivers nearest the capital, gathering thousands of laborers to dig channels and cut new courses through the hills. He did not sit in the capital and send orders. He worked beside his men, waist deep in mud, lifting stones, cutting through reed beds, and showing by his own callous hands that the labor was shared his. Commitment became the stuff of legend. It is told that during his 13 years of work, you passed by the doorway of his own home 3 times, and though he could hear the voices of his wife and children within, he never crossed the threshold unwilling to rest while the flood still claimed lives. The work spread outward in a great web. You traveled to every corner of the realm, charting the highlands and the valleys, noting where the rivers swelled in the spring and where they narrowed in the summer. In each place, he cut channels to lead the floodwaters away from the settlements, sometimes guiding them into lakes, where they could be stored, sometimes into new riverbeds that carried them toward the sea. He deepened river mouths so the water could escape more swiftly, and where the land was too high for the waters to flow, he carved through stone and earth until they could, the earth itself, seem to recognize. His intent for the stories say that he was aided by creatures of the divine realm, a yellow dragon that tore open the channels with its claws, and a great black tortoise that bore stones to strengthen the banks, whether these were spirits or symbols. The truth remains that Yu's work was so vast and unrelenting that it seemed beyond mortal power. As the channels spread and the water found its new paths, the flood began to recede. Villages, long abandoned, were uncovered. Fields emerged from beneath the silt, richer than before, for the layer the river had left behind. The people returned to plant in the black earth, and the smell of fresh grain replaced the stench of rot. Slowly the fear that had gripped the realm loosened its hold. The rivers still ran wide in the rainy season, but they no longer claimed entire provinces. In their fury, the work of control was never truly finished. There would always be storms, always the risk of flood, but the great sea that had covered the heartland was gone. Shan did not take credit for Yu's success. He honored him, openly raising him to the rank of Karula, just as Yao had once done for him under their joint rule. The realm not only recovered but grew. The roads were rebuilt, the markets reopened, and the festivals returned to their proper places in the year. Yet Shun remained vigilant, knowing that peace could be as dangerous as war if it bred complacency. He saw to the settling of disputes between provinces, the strengthening of the border defenses, and the fair collection of tribute. He exiled the 4 fiends lords whose greed and cruelty had poisoned the provinces they ruled, sending them to the farthest reaches of the land, where they could do no harm. The years of joint rule were steady, marked not by great battles, but by the slow, deliberate weaving of a stronger realm. Shun knew his time was drawing to an end, and as Yao had done before him, he chose his successor not from his own blood, but from the one most worthy. Yu, who had tamed the waters and restored the land, was given the throne. Shun's death came quietly, without the storms or portents that had marked other reigns. The people mourned him as a ruler who had led them through hardship without seeking glory for himself, a man who had known when to pass the burden to stronger hands. By the time Yu took the throne, the flood was a memory, though the channels and embankments it had inspired still shaped the land. Shun's reign was remembered as one of balance between tradition and change, between the demands of the present and the needs of the future. And though the rivers ran free to the sea, the lessons of the flood remained, carried in the minds of those who had seen the waters rise and fall, and in the quiet example of the man who had led them through both. You did not inherit the flood as a problem to be solved by decrees from a dry hall. He took it as a personal vow, a lifelong march that would carry him from the headwaters in the mountains to the mudmouth, where the brown rivers meet the open sea. And in that march he fashioned a discipline the realm had never seen. He gathered no court of flatterers, only surveyors with clear eyes and calloused feet, men who could read the fall of a slope at a glance, and hear in the night the way a swollen current gnawed its banks with Then he walked out of the capital and into the drowned heartland, marking with cords and stakes the places where water might choose an easier path, if only the land were persuaded to give it. He met village headmen on narrow ridges where goats picked their way and listened to grandmothers who knew where the ground sank after spring rains, and he made notes with a reed on bark. A rough atlas of channels to be cut and basins to be deepened, a book of intentions that would become a map of salvation. There was no ceremony to this work, only the steady rhythm of digging and hauling, the scrape of stone on stone, the creak of ropes and the grunt of men who had learned that sweat today could mean dry floors tomorrow. The first principle he set was simple and absolute: do not wall the rivers in rage. Lead them, he began, by opening the throats of the great streams that had choked on their own silt, cutting through the bars where centuries of quiet seasons had laid down layer after layer, until a single season of fury sent the waters into the fields. He ordered dredgers lashed from timbers and hides, great scoops worked by teams who sang to keep time as they heaved. The river mouths were deepened so that the sea could drink more of the flood, and along the midlands he had side channels, carved narrow at first, then widened as the water learned to prefer them in the hills. The labour changed where ravines funneled sudden torrents that burst like ambushes. Upon the valleys he cut spillways and stepped the slopes with terraces of stone, so that rain took a slower road to the lowlands and lost its temper along the way in the south. Where the rains were warm and relentless, he joined lakes to one another with ditches that let them pass their burden back and forth, like friends who share a heavy load in the north. Where spring thaw came like the breaking of a siege, he taught the people to clear the ice from culverts before the first sun could send melt water. Raging use authority did not rest only on his plans, it rested on the example of a man who refused comfort while others slept on wet mats. There are tales that he passed his own threshold 3 times in those years, and each time stood with one hand on the doorpost, listening to his child's laughter, then turned away because the line of men and women waiting with shovels in their hands was longer than his longing. Whether every detail is true does not matter as much as the truth the people chose to hold, that their leader's feet were as cracked as their own, that the scars on his shins were from the same sharp reeds, that he bled in the same cold water. Where they bled under such a gaze, the labour taxes became less a demand and more a shared oath. Clans sent their strongest not to curry favour, but because they could not bear to be the village that did less while others toiled along the work lines. Old enemies learned the fellowship of the wheelbarrow and the rope, and disputes that would once have ended in spears were settled by wagers over who could clear the longer cut. By sundown, the flood was not only a matter of water. Chaos breeds its own servants. In places where the standing pools turned black and stank, a 9-headed serpent is said to have made its lair, each head fouling a different stream, so that even fish fled and cattle died when they drank. You came upon this horror in a valley that had not seen a dry hearth in a generation. He did not turn the people's fear into a cult. He turned it into aim. He drove stakes around the marsh to hold the trembling ground. He had the workers haul fresh clay and lay it in courses that firmed under their feet, and when the serpent rose with a sound like many trumpets, he met it with a long-handled blade meant for reeds, and cut until the water ran red and the heads lay slack on the mud. The storytellers make much of that fight, and perhaps they are right to do so, for it was the kind of victory men can count in heartbeats yet. The deeper victory was the one that came after, when you led the people to trench the marsh so that it could never again hide such a thing, and planted willow where the ground still seeped, and built a channel that made stagnation a memory rather than a prophecy. Not all of you's help came from men on certain dawns in the high country. He laid offerings at the edge of cataracts and asked the river god to show Him where the current wished to run, if the stone would yield, he dreamed of a broad-backed tortoise, shouldering boulders into place, and from that dream rose a practical wisdom about cribbing banks with timber and rock, so that they bite deeper into the flow. He read the shape of drifting foam at a bend, and imagined a scaled body burrowing there, then set crews to dig the cut short so that the river would abandon its old elbow for a straighter course, whether one calls these guides spirits, or the fruit of a mind that had given itself wholly to water. The result was the same. The channels grew into a net that laid a gentler law upon the land, a law the rivers obeyed without feeling caged. In the 12th year the work reached its farthest edges. You had walked the spine of ridges that divided the realm, and traced with his staff the lines that would someday be called provinces, each defined as much by its waters as by its hills. In the northwest he stood where 3 streams braided into one, and ordered a wee set not to stop them, but to teach them patience. In the east he watched the tide heave and drop on the same stones, and learned how far the sea's breath reached inland, then cut the last of his channels to carry the flood swiftly to that hungry mouth. He did not forget the small places while he mastered the great. He visited hamlets where children still woke at night to the sound of water climbing their doorsteps, and promised them the hour that sound would change from threat to reassurance, from the voice of ruin to the voice that turns mill wheels and cools summer evenings. Then he kept the promise. When at last the flood stood down, it did not do so with trumpets and banners. It retreated the way a sickness leaves a body that has been nourished and cared for, slowly and with relapses, until one morning the fields that had been a mirror show furrows again, and oxen blow steam in the chill, while men walk behind them, breaking the first crust of a season that will belong to seed rather than to fear. The land left by the water was richer than before. Silt lay in fat layers that took the plough like bread takes a knife, and where you had set lakes in conversation with one another, the fish ran thick as stories at a winter feast. People rebuilt, not as they had rebuilt after fires and raids, with the old haste and the old mistakes, but with the memory of the channels in their minds. House sites move to ground the waters now passed by villagers, turned their squares toward the work of cleaning culverts each spring, as naturally as toward harvest songs in autumn. Shun, who had given you his mandate and shared the weight of rule, watched the waters sink with a satisfaction that did not need praise. He called the engineers to the capital and gave thanks before the altars, then did the quieter thing that holds a realm together. He wrote down what had been learned. He sent copies with his messengers, and charged every governor to set up stones where the channels began and ended, stones inscribed with measures and methods, so that a generation not yet born would know where to dig when the next long rain came. Only when this was done did he raise you above himself, naming him corolla before the assembled lords, so that all could see the order of things as heaven judged it. The last work of this chapter belonged to you as well, though it did not yet carry the name that later ages would give it. He began to think in districts rather than in tribes, in watersheds rather than in bloodlines. He marked boundaries by the way rain runs rather than by the reach of a spear, and called these regions to send their strength to common tasks. In doing so, he founded a habit that would outlive him. When famine struck in one quarter, in a later year granaries in another would open, because the same channels that had carried flood had taught men the shape of belonging. By the time Shun's breath grew thin and his eyes dim, the realm had ceased to be a raft tied together for safety. It had become a vessel with a keel. Shun died without thunder. The rites were kept, the drums were struck, and the people mourned. A man who had looked at a world gone liquid and chosen the one servant who could teach it to be land again. You stood at the bier and accepted the tokens of rule with the same plain gravity with which he had accepted a shovel. The flood was over, but the work of turning what had been rescued into something that could last was only beginning. You began his reign, not in the flush of triumph, but in the steady calm of a man who knew that victory over the flood had been only the first act of a longer play. The waters had withdrawn, yet their memory lingered in the minds of all who had lived through them. Villages were rebuilt on higher ground, granaries raised on stilts, and every spring men walked the channels to clear away silt and reeds before the rains came. You saw that the realm he now ruled was bound together by more than the roads and markets of his predecessors. It was bound by the shared labor that had saved it, and by the understanding that the land itself could be shaped when many hands worked toward one purpose. He resolved to turn this hard-earned unity into the foundation of a new order, one that would last not only for his lifetime, but for generations after. His first concern was the shape of the realm itself in the age before the flood. The land had been divided by blood and tribe, each clan holding its territory with little regard for its neighbors, except when war or trade made contact unavoidable. You had seen the weakness of this arrangement when the flood struck. A swollen river cares nothing for clan boundaries, and aid withheld by one group could doom the next. He chose to draw the realm not according to ancient claims, but according to the flow of water and the lay of the land. He divided it into 9 great provinces, each named for the qualities of its soil, its rivers, or its mountains. This was more than a crafter's whim, it was a vision of governance, rooted in the earth itself, in the belief that a ruler's duty was to understand and provide for the land and people together. In each province you appointed officials, not for their loyalty to him, but for their skill and fairness. He gave them the task of keeping the channels in order, settling disputes between farmers over irrigation, and seeing that the tribute due to the throne was gathered without cruelty. Tribute itself was a carefully measured thing. You knew that in times of plenty a portion of the harvest could be spared for the capital, but that in lean years to demand the same would be to sue rebellion. He traveled often to each province to see with his own eyes what the reports could not show, how the soil felt beneath the plough, how the market stalls were stocked, how the people spoke of their governors when they thought no one of rank was listening. His presence among them was not ceremonial. He walked the roads in plain garments, speaking to the old and the young, measuring his success by the way their eyes met his. It was during these journeys that you began to collect the stories and customs of the people, preserving them as part of the realm's identity. He knew that unity was not achieved only through roads, laws, and taxes, but through the weaving of many local threads into a fabric that all could recognize as their own. In the festivals of the South, he saw dancers that told the tale of the dragon kings. In the northern hills, he heard songs of the first hunters who followed the elk across the mountains. In the central plains, he watched plays performed in the market squares about the great flood itself. You encouraged these stories, for he understood that they bound people to their history as much as his channels bound the rivers to their courses. The harmony he sought was not without its trials. Even in the calm after the flood, there were those who saw in the new order an opportunity to grasp more than their share. Banditry returned in some borderlands, and in the far west a coalition of discontented chiefs refused to pay tribute, claiming that you provinces had erased their ancestral rights. You did not rush to war. He sent envoys to speak plainly of what was expected and what would be given in return. Only when his words were met with open raids did he march, not with a massive army meant to crush, but with swift companies that moved as the rivers do, striking where the enemy was weak, cutting off their supplies, and leaving the choice to submit or starve. In the end, most chose to bend rather than break, and those who did were restored to their lands under the same law as all others. Whose reign was marked by a rare balance between firmness and restraint. He held the authority of one who had saved the realm, but he used it sparingly, always seeking to persuade before he compelled. His justice was steady, neither softened by favoritism nor hardened by cruelty. When disputes arose between provinces, he heard them in person, weighing the words of each side before rendering a judgment that left no doubt of his impartiality. Over time, this earned him a reputation, not only as the tamer of the flood, but as the ruler who made the land itself the measure of his rule. Yet even as the fields yielded in abundance, and the markets overflowed with grain, you did not forget that fortune can turn. He strengthened the storage systems begun in the wake of the flood, building great granaries in each province, so that in years of drought or excessive rain, the people could be fed without stripping the land bare. He ordered forests to be planted on the slopes where erosion had begun to gnaw away the soil, and he protected the headwaters of the great rivers from overuse. To you, ruling well was not only to respond to disaster, but to guard against the conditions that bred it. In the quiet evenings of his later years, you would sometimes walk the banks of the channels he had cut, now grown smooth with moss and lined with reeds. Fishermen cast their nets in waters that had once been a raging brown torrent. Children played in fields that had been under 10 feet of water. When he was young, he knew that in time his own life would pass into the same half-light of legend as Yao and Shun before him, but he also knew that what he had built was not just a story, it was a living system of land and people bound together as firmly as the rivers to their new beds. And it was this, not the memory of the flood, that he hoped would endure. The later years of Yu's reign were marked by the kind of stillness that comes not from idleness, but from a realm that has settled into the steady rhythm of order. The flood had been tamed, the provinces defined, the laws tempered and tested. Yet you knew that still waters, if left unattended, could turn stagnant. The channels he had cut needed watching, the officials he had appointed needed holding to account, and the bonds between the 9 provinces had to be kept alive through more than tribute and decrees. He traveled constantly, not with the urgency of a man battling disaster, but with the watchfulness of a keeper tending a vast garden. Wherever he went, he inspected the state of the rivers, tasted the grain at market, and spoke to the elders about the conduct of their governors. He had no patience for arrogance in his officers, and more than one found themselves stripped of title and sent back to work the same fields they had neglected. But Yu was not only a ruler of discipline, he was a ruler of foresight. He knew that the unity he had forged could not rest solely on the memory of the flood, for memory fades with each passing season. He began to shape a culture of shared duty and pride among the provinces, encouraging exchanges of craftsmen, farmers, and scholars between regions. A potter from the east might find himself teaching his craft in the highlands. A farmer from the north might learn new methods of rice cultivation in the south. These exchanges wove the provinces together, not just by law, but by human ties, so that a man could look upon the goods in his own market and see not strangers' work, but the work of neighbors he had met by name. In matters of governance, Yu's legacy was not only in his division of the land into 9 provinces, but in the way he balanced central authority with local knowledge. While the thrones set the greater laws, each province was free to keep its own customs and festivals, so long as they did not violate the peace of the realm. This fostered a sense that the empire was not a single stone block, but a mosaic, each piece distinct, yet forming a greater whole. And though the great markets of the capital brimmed with goods from every corner of the land, you took as much pleasure in the small fairs of distant villages, where he could walk unannounced among the people and see how they lived when no lord was watching. The peace he had built did not go untested. In the far northeast, nomadic tribes, driven by hunger after a harsh winter, began to raid the border villages. You did not rush to destroy them. He sent envoys bearing grain and salt, offering them a Not only as the savior who had tamed the flood, but as the founder of a dynasty. His court urged him to name his heir, not from among the most capable in the realm as Yao and Shun had done before, but from his own blood. You hesitated, knowing that the mandate of heaven rested on virtue, not lineage, yet he had seen his Saunchi grow into a man of skill and command, and in time you came to believe that the realm was ready to be passed from father to son without breaking the chain of order. It was a choice. Place within the order of the 9 provinces, if they would settle and turn their hands to the plough. Some accepted becoming new voices in the growing chorus of the realm. Those who refused and returned to raiding were met not with pity, but with swift calculated force, their camps broken and their herds taken. As restitution, Yuzhui was always to offer the open hand before the closed fist. But once the fist closed, it did so without hesitation. As the years passed, the people began to speak of the great Yu that would shape the future for it, marked the beginning of hereditary rule in China's long history. In the final season of his life, Yu strength began to wane. He withdrew from the long circuits of inspection, spending more days in the capital, though he still walked the banks of the nearest rivers and visited the granaries at harvest. When the end came, it was without storm or omen. He died as he had lived, calmly with his work in order, leaving behind a realm at peace. The 9 provinces remained bound together by the rivers he had set in their courses, by the laws he had written, and by the habit of unity that had grown under his reign. The people mourned him, not with fear for what would come next, but with gratitude for what had been in the villages. Old men told children of the years when the flood covered the land, and of the man who walked its length to turn it back in the provinces. Governors ordered the clearing of channels and the inspection of dikes in his honor, for this was the work that had made all other work possible. And in the capital his body was laid to rest beneath a mound shaped like a low sill, so that it seemed as though the earth itself had risen to keep him. Your name would endure in the histories, not as a conqueror of men, but as a conqueror of chaos, a ruler who shaped the very bones of the land and gave his people the means to master it. His reign closed the age of Yao and Shun and opened a new chapter in the story of the Middle Kingdom, one where the throne would pass from father to son, where the rivers would keep to their paths, and where the memory of the flood would live on, not in fear, but in the order it had inspired from the midst of beginnings. When the world was a chaos of shadow and light, through the birth of heaven and earth, through the rise of the first sovereigns, who ruled not with iron, but with the weight of their virtue, through the weaving of law, from the raw threads of clan and custom, the story of Chinese mythology stands as both legend and history. In its earliest ages, gods and mortals walked the same paths, their voices mingling in the same halls. Their disputes settled in the same blood, from Pangu's sundering of the void to the labors of Nuer, from the fierce battles against demons and the ordering of the seasons by the august emperors. The tapestry was drawn wider with each age, each figure adding their own color and texture. It was an age where order was not given but fought for, first by Hangdi, the yellow emperor who carved unity out of the warring tribes, then by Zuanshu, who closed the way between heaven and earth so that men might stand on their own feet, then by Shan, who saw in the rising waters the measure of a man's worth, and in Yu, who bent his life to the taming of those waters. These were not idle figures in painted scrolls. They were men who bore the weight of entire worlds upon their backs, men whose decisions bound the fate of countless others, and whose triumphs and failures alike became the bones of the realm itself. The myth becomes history somewhere along this road, though there is no single stone that marks the place. The gods withdraw, the spirits are heard less often, and the rulers are no longer chosen by visions in the clouds, but by the blood in their veins. Yet the old ways never vanish entirely. The rivers still run according to the courses you set for them, the mountains still hold the temples to the first gods, and the people still tell the stories in which heaven once bent low enough to touch the Earth, each dynasty that followed, would draw upon these origins to legitimize its own claim, speaking of the mandate of heaven, as if it were a torch passed from Pangu's first light through the hands of all who had ruled before, and so the world that began in chaos found its rhythm. The provinces worked their fields, the markets filled with the goods of distant regions, and the capital grew into a city whose walls were built on both stone and memory. The rulers who came after you would wage wars, raise palaces, and build their own monuments to endure the turning of the ages, but always somewhere in their halls they would hang a painting or a carving of the flood's high waters and of the man who stood against them, for it was in the age of the floods, taming, that the Middle Kingdom learned the truth at the heart of all its myths, that the work of order is never finished, that each generation inherits both the gifts and the burdens of the one before, and that the greatest power is not in the sword, nor even in the crown, but in the patient shaping of the world, so that it can endure. Thus the story ends where it was always meant to end, not in the heavens, nor in the depths, but here on the living earth, among the people who walk it. The rivers keep to their paths, the soil yields its grain, and the stories are told still by firelight under the same moon that shone upon Pangu Enua, Hangdianyu, and in those stories the gods walk again, the emperors rule again, and the land is forever remade in the telling. That's it. This journey into the depths of ancient Chinese mythology not only presented us with fantastic monsters and heroes, but also revealed a universe shaped by Taoism and Buddhism, built upon order, morality, and cyclical time. From Pangu's cosmic sacrifice to Mengpo's soup of oblivion, each story showed me that life is not just a beginning and an end, but also part of an endless cycle. Even Sun Wukong's rebellion ultimately served a higher purpose and order. These myths provide a framework for understanding how even the smallest decisions in an individual's life can affect cosmic balance. If you enjoyed this mystical journey through thousands of years of wisdom, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future stories. Perhaps Viking mythology